think we're ready to start. So, welcome everybody. This is our fourth Work of Literary Merit presentation. We've had some wonderful ones last week, and I want to thank everybody in the English department and in tech who have helped us make this happen. I'm so honored today to introduce a wonderful guest. We're going to go for about an hour, about 55 minutes of talk, followed by a Q&A. If by chance you have to leave before the presentation is over, please avoid walking in front of our camera. It's being videotaped today. So I am Abby Bogomolny with the English department. I'm so honored to have Walter Turner here today. He is a leading authority on contemporary African-American affairs and a historian on the African diaspora. He's professor of social sciences and the chairperson of the department at the College of Marin. He teaches U.S. history, contemporary African politics, African-American history, and African history. He's also the producer and the host of the weekly Pacifica program, Africa Today, aired on KPFA in Berkeley, 94.1. Matter of fact, there's a program this evening, Monday nights. He is also the author of Oil for Nothing, Multinational Corporations, Environmental Destruction, Death and Impunity in the Niger Delta, and one of the authors of the book, No Easy Victories, African Liberation and American Activists Over a Half Century, 1950 to 2000. But that's not all. In addition to his writing, his teaching, and broadcasting, Walter Turner is the president of the board of directors of Global Exchange, a San Francisco-based human rights organization. He serves on the advisory board of the Paul Robeson Film Initiative in African Cinema, on the board of directors of the Freedom Archives and the Priority Africa Network. He also produces the annual Marin City Community Festival. For his international work and activism, he has received the Martin Luther King Humanitarian Award, the Golden Bell Award, and has been selected as National Faculty Member of the Year. His commentaries have appeared in The Black Scholar, Pacifica National News, National Public Radio, and PBS. In short, Walter Turner's teaching, writing, and activism have touched the lives of so many people in a positive way. No less than Nelson Mandela wrote a foreword for the book Walter Turner co-authored. Mandela writes, "No easy victories makes clear that our lives and fortunes around the globe are linked." So please join me in welcoming Walter Turner.
Wow, it's my pleasure to be here. I don't know that I was ever one for long introductions. There's a film by Malcolm X, which is called, actually the title about Malcolm X, which is entitled "Make It Plain." And whenever Malcolm X was introduced, he would always say at some point, he would say, "Make it plain." And that was a signal to wrap up the introduction and to get into the meat of the discussion. So I really appreciate the honor to be able to talk and to talk about James Baldwin and to talk about history. James Baldwin is one of those people who is really part of the centuries-long black freedom struggle. I watched the other evening the film which you saw the other evening, which was entitled The Price of the Ticket, which is actually one of his essays. And for those of you who've ever been to New York and had an opportunity to be at St. John's the Divine, it's a beautiful church. And as you see the processional coming in the church for the funeral of James Baldwin, you can see Olatunji, who is one of the most famous drummers from the African continent, who spent a lot of time here in the United States. And he's drumming, and there's a whole entourage of drummers. And you see the faces of Maya Angelou, you see the faces of Amiri Baraka. And one of the things that's so important in terms of African traditions are the services. That really makes the difference. In the African American community, we always say, you know, you put your mother away good, or you put your father away good, because that transition in terms of the relationship between those people who are living, those people who are yet born, and those people who have made their transition, or those people who have gone home, like James Baldwin, is very, very important. Those people that we talk about exist in a world that we refer to as the Zamani. I mean that as long as there's someone who knew them, that they exist in the world and they play a role in the world. And so it's very important that you have the type of ceremony, you have the type of circumstance that calls the ancestors to be in view. And that ceremony that you see with James Baldwin is very, very beautiful, it's very touching. I think one thing as I was watching it the other evening, and that's one of the great things about being able to talk today, it's given me an opportunity to look and think about James Baldwin. And I'll talk a bit about where I first heard about James Baldwin and became attracted to James Baldwin. There's a film actually by, At the River I Stand, which is a beautiful film about Martin Luther King. And it's about Martin Luther King's his last 2 weeks working in Memphis, Tennessee, when he's there for the garbage workers strike. And Baldwin will talk about that in this clip that we'll see. And at some point on the night of April 3rd, when Martin Luther King is getting ready go out to dinner, go out for the services, he says, well, tell so-and-so who's the organist for the church, I want them to play Precious Lord. I want them to play it real pretty. And it's just so ironic that when you're listening to James Baldwin, when you're looking at the services, that there James Baldwin is, and he's singing that song, Precious Lord. And in some senses, that's part of the African American tradition. It's a messianic tradition. It's a tradition that things are always going to get better. And you can hear that in Baldwin's voice, and you hear him struggling throughout the years to try to make that particular dream come true. I first came in touch with James Baldwin when I was a member of the Black Panther Party. And one of the things that we did in the Black Panther Party is that we read collectively. And there was a gentleman, his name was Fred Bennett, he was one of our first teachers. He came over every week from Oakland, and he brought books over to where I grew up, which was in Marin City, right there as you head through Sausalito up toward the bridge, toward the Golden Gate Bridge. And I remember some of the things that we read. We read The War of the Flea, which was a study about guerrilla warfare. We read The Red Book by Mao Zedong, which I still have my copy of. We read The Black Book by Kwame Nkrumah, the first leader of independent Ghana in the late 1950s. We read books by Ingalls on family state. We read Mao Zedong on dialectical materialism and on contradiction. And two things that stuck in my mind that we read over and over again. One was a film, The Battle of Algiers. And I don't know that a week went by that we didn't see The Battle of Algiers. I've probably seen The Battle of Algiers 150 times at this point. But the other book that we read was a book which was entitled The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon. And it's interesting. At some point when we were reading through those books, we really didn't understand the books. I didn't understand what I was reading. Wretched of the Earth, if you've ever taken a look at it, take a peek at it, is layered with notions of colonialism and psychology and struggle, etc. It's a very, very layered text. And I don't know that anybody in the group understood what we were reading, but we all pretended like we did. I think one of the reasons that we didn't understand really fit into that moment. And they were the fact, essentially, that we were too busy. In contrast to what media has said or J. Edgar Hoover said about the Black Panther Party, most of our time was not spent worrying about the police. Most of our time was spent doing community work, whether it was programs for children, whether it was making sure that people got to see their families in jails, whether it was independent schools, whether it was redevelopment. That's where most of our energy was. Now, I think the other part of our energy was spent on our notions, without question, that we were part of the vanguard. And when you ask my friends, those who still survived through those years, there was no doubt in our mind that we were in the vanguard and that people were going to follow us. We didn't even check behind us to see if people were going to follow us. We knew that people were going to follow us. And at some point, James Baldwin was part of that particular story. And his book, which is The Fire Next Time, came out in the 1960s. And James Baldwin made that connection with the Black Panther Party. Not only did he meet, and you know, as you look at James Baldwin, I mean, there's so much to read about James Baldwin. As I looked through some of the essay books I had and read through some of the pieces I wanted to read through over the last 2 or 3 weeks, surely you're going to find places where there's contradiction, where it doesn't make sense, where it doesn't seem to match up. But let's be honest here. He wrote from the time he was 16 years old for the entire rest of his life. He wrote and he wrote and he wrote, and you look at it and he wrote about it. So this notion that you can write as much as he did and talk as much as he did and be as active as he did and not have contradiction, not have things that didn't make sense, really doesn't work. But James Baldwin was, he spoke early on with people such as Eldridge Cleaver, with whom he had tensions at one point. He had tensions with Eldridge Cleaver, and then later Eldridge Cleaver, during the Black Panther Party, when they're in exile in Algeria, one of the first things Eldridge Cleaver does is writes to James Baldwin and says, "Hey, James, I need some money. You know, James, I need $10,000. And James is like, "Hey, I'll send you something, but because of the way you treated, because of the way you hated on me, I'm not going to send you $10,000. And he meets Huey Newton, and he meets Bobby Seale. And then later on in his life, he spent some time around a couple of people who were members of the Black Panther and supported the Black Panther Party. One is Angela Davis, and his letter to Angela Davis is a beautiful letter. And you can see Baldwin wrestling with this, what I call the citizenship contradiction, as he goes through his life, as he's trying to navigate this period where your citizenship seems to have almost everything to do with your nationality. And this is one of the struggles that's constantly been a struggle for African American people in this country, what we call the citizenship contradiction. And you'll see it when James Baldwin meets with Kennedy in the 1960s, in 1963, 1964, some of the most difficult periods of Baldwin's life. Why don't we do this? We're going to take a look at a video here, and then I want to come back and talk about a couple of areas which aren't talked a lot about in terms of James Baldwin. This is let me set the tone for this particular interview. This interview is in one of the most active field years of Baldwin's life. This is probably 2 days or 3 days after he's had an opportunity to meet with Robert Kennedy. This is the same year that Medgar Evers is killed. This is the same year of the March on Washington. It's the same year of so many different things, of the bombings in Birmingham, etc. And Kenneth Clark, who you see here, was at the meeting. It was a meeting with Attorney General Robert Kennedy, and Kenneth Clark, who's a writer, historian, and interviewer, had a program show. This is maybe 2 days later. Lorraine Hansberry was also there. Lorraine Hansberry will live about another year or so after this. So if I can start this, then I'll go with this from here.
I suppose as time goes on, the older you
No,
get.
that's not what I wanted.
In a funny way, the less you
I
know.
wanted to go back.
The more you learn.
You said something that you cannot expect them to remain
You can't?
constantly nonviolent.
No, you can't. You can't. And furthermore, there were always, these students that we're talking about, a minority. The students we're talking about, when I was in Tallahassee, there were some students protesting. But there were many, 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 many more students who had given up, who were desperate, and whom Malcolm X can reach, for example, much more easily than I can.
What do you mean?
What Malcolm tells them, in effect, is they should be proud of being black, and God knows that they should be. That's a very important thing to hear in a country which assures you you should be ashamed of it. Of course, in order to do this, what he does is destroy a truth and invent a history. What he does is say, you're better because you're black. Well, of course, that isn't true. That's the trouble.
Do you think that this is an appealing approach, and that the black Muslims, in preaching black supremacy, seek to exploit the frustration of the Negro?
I don't think, put it as simply as I can, and without trying now to investigate whatever the motives of any given Muslim leader may be. It is the only movement in the country which we can call grassroots. I hate to say that, but it's true. Because it is only the mountain talks, all the Muslim ministers talk, they articulate for all the Negro people who hear them, who listen to them. They articulate their suffering. The suffering which has been in this country so long denied. That's Malcolm's great authority over any of his audiences. He corroborates their reality. He tells them that they really exist, you know?
Jim, do you think that this is a more effective appeal than the appeal of Martin Luther King?
It's much more sinister because it is much more effective. It's much more effective because it is, after all, comparatively easy to invest a population with a false morale by giving them a false sense of superiority. And it will always break down in a crisis. It's the history of Europe, simply. It's one of the reasons we're in this terrible place. It's one of the reasons that we have 5 cops standing on a black woman's neck in Birmingham. Because at some point they believed, they were taught and they believed that they were better than other people because they were white. It leads to a moral bankruptcy. It is inevitable. It cannot but lead there. But my point here is that the country is for the first time worried about the Muslim movement. It shouldn't be worried about the Muslim movement. That's not the problem. The problem is to eliminate the conditions which breed the Muslim movement.
Well, I'd like to come back to get some of your thoughts about the relationship between Martin Luther King's appeal, that is effectively nonviolence, and his philosophy of disciplined love for the oppressor.
But Martin,
and what do you think what is the relationship between this and the reality of the Negro masses?
well, to leave Martin out of it for a moment. Martin's very rare, very great man. Martin's rare for 2 reasons. Partly because just because he is. And because he's a real Christian, and he really believes in nonviolence. He's arrived at something in himself, which permits him, allows him to do it. And he still has great moral authority in the South. There's none whatever in the North. Poor Martin has gone through God knows what kind of hell to awaken the American conscience. But Martin has reached the end of his rope. There's some things Martin can't do. Martin's only one man. Martin can't solve the nation's central problem by himself. There are lots of people, lots of black people I mean now, who don't go to church no more and don't listen to Martin, you know. And who anyway are themselves produced by civilization, which has always glorified violence, unless the Negro had the gun. So that Martin is undercut by the performance of the country. The country is only concerned about nonviolence if it seems that I'm going to get violent. But it's not worried about nonviolence if it's some Alabama sheriff.
Jim, what do you see deep in the recesses of your own mind as the future of our nation? And I ask that question in that way because I think that the future of the Negro and the future of the nation are linked.
They're indissoluble.
Yeah. Now, what do you see? Are you essentially optimistic or pessimistic? And I really don't want to put words in your mouth because what I really want to find out is what you really believe.
Well, I'm both glad and sorry you asked me that question. I'll do my best to answer it. I can't be a pessimist because I'm alive. To be a pessimist means that you have agreed that human life is an academic matter. So I'm forced to be an optimist. I'm forced to believe that we can survive whatever we must survive. But the Negro in this country, the future of the Negro in this country is precisely as bright or as dark as the future of the country. It is entirely up to the American people and our representatives. It is entirely up to the American people whether or not they're going to face and deal with and embrace this stranger whom they've maligned so long. What white people have to do is try to find out in their own hearts why it was necessary to have a nigger in the first place. Because I'm not a nigger. I'm a man. But if you think I'm a nigger, it means you need it. The question you've got to ask yourself, the white population of this country has got to ask itself, North and South, because it's one country, and for a Negro, there is no difference in the North and the South. There's just a difference in the way they castrate you. But the fact of the castration is the American fact. If I'm not the nigger here, and you invented him, you, the white people, invented him, then you got to find out why.
Well,
and the future of the country depends on that, whether or not it's able to ask that question.
As a Negro and as an American, I can only hope that America has the strength and the capacity,
the moral strength,
to ask and answer that question in affirmative and constructive ways.
To face that question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken.
Ooh. That is James Baldwin speaking in 1963, right after his meeting with Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General. And
in the northern streets,
he's making the point that the situation between, he's making a comparison there in some sense between both the why people are gravitating to the message of Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. And he's also talking very clearly there about the limitations of the philosophy of Martin Luther King. And this is always something because James Baldwin, if nothing else, is an American. There's a story of a historian, John Henry Clark, who talks about the day that Kennedy was assassinated. And he talks about wanting to cry. He talks about really wanting to be an American. He really wants to talk about having a president that he feels like crying for. And he says that Kennedy is a good man, but that African people, black people, colonized people, so much wanted someone that they could embrace. And this is the dilemma that's being faced by Martin Luther King. This is the dilemma of the period of the 1963. I want to talk a bit about a piece of James Baldwin that doesn't get talked about a lot, and that is the piece about James Baldwin and Pan-Africanism. James Baldwin is very fortunate, and we're very fortunate, that James Baldwin lived through all the phases of what we call the modern civil rights movement. And people date it in different ways. Many people feel that the beginning of the modern civil rights movement has a lot to do with African-American soldiers who returned from World War II. Where they've been taught that the struggle has to be the fight against the Nazis, the struggle to stop Hitler. But when they come back to the United States, they find out they're not able to use the toilet. They're not able to eat. They're not able to go where they want to. And that creates a firestorm When African-American soldiers come back, it's a change. And this is something which has always been a legacy of the African-American experience. Whether you're talking about the American Revolution, whether you're talking about the Civil War, whether you're talking about the War of 1812, whether you're talking particularly about the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, etc. When African-American soldiers have come back, they've looked at the country with a different set of eyes. Some would say that the beginning of the modern civil rights movement has to do when Eleanor Roosevelt stepped in to make sure that Marian Anderson would have an opportunity to sing. The Daughters of the Constitution had said she can't sing in Constitution Hall. So Eleanor Roosevelt arranged for her to sing at the Lincoln Memorial. Some would say that the modern civil rights movement begins with the murder of Emmett Till. And this is, of course, one of the subjects of one of the plays that James Baldwin did. The story of Emmett Till, and right after that, the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott. That's what I refer to as the first phase of the modern civil rights movement, that period from post-World War II up until the period of the 1960s. The second phase of the modern civil rights movement basically goes from the period of 1960 up until 1963. And that second phase is really marked by some of the things that James Baldwin will encounter on his second visit to the South in the 1960s. His first visit was in 1957. And that would be the rise of Snick. This is a game changer. When young people very purposely and very deliberately decide that they want to make sure, along with Ella Baker, decide that they want, if you haven't had an opportunity to read that particular book, take a look at it. It's written by a good friend of mine, Barbara Ransby, The Story of Ella Baker. When Ella Baker and the students decide that they want to purposely have some space between them and the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which Martin Luther King had been a key founder of in 1957. And that's going to go up to the period of 1963 in the March on Washington. And if I have time, I'll talk about the March on Washington today. And coming out of that, Martin Luther King, after 1963 and 1964, realizes a couple of things. That this movement to socially change, this is one of the difficulties you constantly find in American history as reference to African American. It's one thing to be able to put laws on the books. It's another thing to be able to enforce that social change, to change that consciousness that changes the way that we interact socially. And James Baldwin always thought that that could happen. I mean, when you read Toni Morrison's Eulogy to James Baldwin, one of the things she thanks James Baldwin for is this willingness always to love, to find the space to be tender, etc. But Martin Luther King realizes, number one, as the war in Vietnam is accelerating, that there's no way, and this might be a memo for us today, that there's no way that you can spend millions and millions and billions of dollars on conflict and address social problems at home. It doesn't work. It's not possible. But the other thing that Martin Luther King begins to realize is that it's not just a question of this social and moral stance. And you hear James Baldwin address that when he talks about the young people in the South in the 1960s and the 1950s, that there had to be some economic justice. And so for that next part of his life, from 1963, August 1963, all the way up until the period of 1968, April 4th, 1968, just a couple of days ago in history, when Martin Luther King is murdered in Memphis, Tennessee. And I use the word murder very, very purposely. I mean, FBI COINTEL program followed Martin Luther King. There's recently been a study that the FBI COINTEL program and the FBI followed James Baldwin. They followed Langston Hughes. They thought that there was something too militant, there was something communistic, there was something subversive about all of these particular writers. The FBI followed Martin Luther King every day of his life. So where were they on April 4th, 1968? And James Baldwin makes a point. He says he doesn't think that Lee Harvey Oswald left Memphis and swam across the Atlantic to get to London on his own. So that's what we refer to as the third phase of the modern civil rights movement. But James Baldwin keeps going beyond that. One of the things that's very interesting is there's a term that we use. I use it a lot when I'm talking about Africa. I know you can hear me. You can probably hear me without this mic. My voice is kind of loud here, okay? It reminds me that James Baldwin is at a church, I guess it's in Florida in the 1960s, and his old preacher comes back to him, and they invite him to come up and say something, and he comes up and says something. When he leaves, some of the people in the church say, yeah, he's little, but he's loud. So I know my voice is very loud. This phrase of what I call Pan-Africanism, Black nationalism and Pan-Africanism, these are two themes that are rooted in African-American history. Most historians would say that Black nationalism is rooted in slavery. And what do I mean by that? Too much history maybe here today, but maybe not enough history, meaning that African people identify by their language group. They don't identify by their color, people from the African continent. Black nationalism is a result of the forced migration of African people to the New World, and of them finding themselves in similar situations, create what we call a culture. It's a, how do I say it? It's a nebulous notion of racial unity. People of different language groups who come together because they find themselves in the same situation. If you see a book by Nell Painter, beautiful, beautiful book, Creating Black Americans, where she talks about this particular theme of creating of culture, mixes with this notion of Africa. And James Baldwin, I think, makes his first visit to Africa in 1962. And he attends one of the most important conferences at the most important times in Paris. He'd moved to Paris in 1948. In 1956, he goes to the First International Congress of Black Writers and Artists. And why is this important that James Baldwin is in a conference with African writers in 1956? It's important because, as James Baldwin talks about, I think probably in The Price of the Ticket, he says that this is the heat of the war in Algeria. Remember the movie I talked about I'd seen 1,000 times? But this is also a year after, 1 year after, the Bandung Conference of Indonesia in 1955. And people around the country have been celebrating. This is what we call the non-aligned conference. And people were there from Algeria trying to break the chains of French colonialism. They were there from Egypt, they were from Ethiopia, they were from Ghana, they were from Libya, they were Sudan. And if you listen to the speech by Malcolm X, which was also given in 1963, Malcolm X, in his speeches, a fabulous speech about black nationalism called Message to the Grassroots, also talks about the importance of the Bandung Conference. So James Baldwin is there. He's there at this particular conference. Richard Wright is there, the author of Native Son and Black Boy, Lord Today, The Outsider, one of my favorite novels of all time by Richard Wright, The Outsider. He's there at the same of Leopold Senghor, who became the president of Senegal, one of the founders of what we refer to the Negritude movement. He's there at the same time of Cheikh Anta Diop. Cheikh Anta Diop is a giant in terms of African studies. He was one of the leaders who went to the early conferences on Egypt and began to challenge who the Egyptians were. Aimé Césaire, who's a brilliant discourse on colonialism. And Baldwin is there, and if you read through that, I think the title of it is called The Princes and Powers. At times you can hear Baldwin, who's still fighting with this notion of, trying to find a middle ground there between militancy and denigration of U.S. policy and some type of activism in this period of history. Baldwin would later leave there, and right after that particular conference, in 1957, he would go and meet Martin Luther King. He would meet Martin Luther King in the South. What's important about this is that these ideas about Pan-Africanism, these ideas about black nationalism, when you read through Baldwin, The Fire Next Time, and that letter to his nephew, and he's talking about, essentially, I think I have it somewhere here, he's saying to him, in short, he's saying to him in a brief moment there. He's saying, if I see it, that you're black, and that he says the innocent country set you down in a ghetto. He says, let me spell out precisely what I mean by the heart of the matter is here, and the crux of my dispute with this country. You were born where you were born and faced the future that you faced because you were black and for no other reason. And so this conference that we're looking at in 1956 is exactly that conference about this ideal of colonialism, that it is not now and has never been anything that was benevolent, that the only goal of the colonizer was economic exploitation, and it was totally self-centered. Who else is at this conference? Fran Fanon, who would later write The Wretched of the Earth. So it's a historic conference in terms of Baldwin's attendance. I mean, I think in some senses Baldwin is a bit like I was as a member of the Black Panther Party, doesn't quite get it. He doesn't quite get what this dialogue is about, but that would make James Baldwin essentially at that time 30 years old, late 20s, early 30 years old, born in 1924. So he's 30 years old. He leaves the United States in 1948. He comes to Paris essentially with nothing, I think with $30 or $40, and at this point he is still trying to figure it out. You know, you read some historians in there, Eldridge Cleaver was very, very critical of Baldwin and the way that Baldwin reacted to this particular conference. But again, you're going to see that 2 years later, when James Baldwin, as Martin Luther King was, becomes involved in the African liberation movement, that he begins to talk. Baldwin is, you know, as I think through it, I don't know that he's a Pan-Africanist on purpose, Pan-Africanist by accident. I have a very good friend in New York. His name is David Henderson. David Henderson is a poet extraordinaire. His book is entitled Excuse Me While I Kiss the Sky, which is the story of Jimi Hendrix. And David Henderson has been writing poetry. He was with Umbra Arts in New York, etc. Very, very powerful stuff. And I asked David, I said, you know, David, why is Jimmy, as they call him, we're calling him James Baldwin. I was speaking with Angela Davis a couple of weeks ago. She said, yeah, you mean Jimmy. That's how they referred to him, as Jimmy, or they referred to him as, Kenneth Clark referred to them as Jim. I said, was Jimmy an activist, or was he a writer who just happened to be in activist circles? And David said to me, he said, you know, and you see it in that movie, The Price of the Ticket, that Jimmy always surrounded himself with people. And David said, you know, people came up to James all the time, and they wanted to share things with him, and they wanted to talk to him about different things. And so he was always listening. He wasn't, as what we call in African history, he was a griot. A griot is somebody from one of the West African societies. It's an oral tradition. You see it among the Fulani, the Mandingo, the Bambara people. These are the people who are kind of like the human record of a society, of the cultural, the political history. It's a very, very elevated position because you're supposed to remember the history of your particular community. So Jimmy Baldwin is a griot. He finds himself there, and everybody's listening to. He's listening to everybody. In the film, The Price of the Ticket, at some point, at the very end, though, the guy says to me, you know, I don't know how Jimmy was able to write because he was up all night. Jimmy was up all night doing the Dougie. Jimmy was up all night partying. You know, how was Jimmy able to write? He said that Jimmy would drink and dance and everything else, and then he would go back to his typewriter, and he would type up until the period of the early morning. So I'm setting James Baldwin in this context of being a Pan-Africanist. These years that you're looking at here in the 1960s, as we talked about, with the Freedom Summer, and when James Baldwin goes to the South and he meets with members of CORE, who probably don't get enough credit in African American history for the role that they played. This is what we call the second phase of the civil rights movement. And James Baldwin takes a piece from, in his essay, They Can't Turn Back. And he's making a statement about this growing militancy. He's like a clairvoyant. He sees what's He sees what's coming. He's trying to find some balance there. American kept wondering, what has got into these students? I'm quoting him. What has got into them is their history in this country. They are not the first Negroes to face mob. They are merely the first Negroes to frighten the mob more than the mob frightens them. Many Americans have forgotten, for example, the reign of terror in the 1920s that drove Negroes out of the South. 500,000 African American people moved north in 1 year. Some of the people who got to the north barely in time to be born are the parents of the students now going to school. That was 40 years ago, and not enough has happened. Not enough freedom has happened. But these young people are determined to make it happen and make it happen now. This is the same year of the Cuban Revolution. And when you look at the discussion between James Baldwin and Robert Kennedy, he raises that question about the Cuban Revolution. His good friend, Maya Angelou, is one of the people who organizes the protest around the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. And again, this is a turning point that James Baldwin is right on these edges of. I didn't find over the years as I've read through James Baldwin that he wrote extensively from this notion that he saw himself as a Pan-Africanist. But when Patrice Lumumba was assassinated in January of 1961, here he is, one of the first beautiful book to read, of course, King Leopold's Ghost by Adam Hochschild, brilliant piece which talks about King Leopold in the Congo. When Patrice Lumumba, who's the first legitimate prime minister of the Congo, was assassinated in 1961, less than 6 months after he's in office, the world is outraged. People are in the streets in Belgium, people are in the streets in France, people are in the streets all over the world. And this is at the same time that the events are happening in Cuba with the Cuban Revolution. And in 1959, you see it in that movie, one of the Godfather movies, where they're at the nightclub and one of the people in the nightclub runs up to the mic and says, you know, the rebels are on the outskirts of the city, good night and good luck. And people flee. That's the same moment in which James Baldwin finds himself in history. The years of 1963 to 1965 are like what I referred to as the third phase of the modern civil rights movement. And again, this is a period that Jimmy is so much a part of. There is the murder of Medgar Evers. There's the bombing in Birmingham, which if you read through James Baldwin says, look, the Birmingham situation, who was responsible for the events in Birmingham? It was J. Edgar Hoover, and it was the Kennedy boys. Okay, that's the way Malcolm X referred to them, the Kennedy boys. John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy. This eventual assassination we'll see in 1965, moving ahead to move back, is something that really has an impact on James Baldwin, and it really has an impact on Amiri Baraka. Amiri Baraka passed away too soon a couple of years ago, Leroy Jones. And in fact, sometimes when I'm watching James Baldwin, and I was going to play it for you today, but I like to talk more than I like to play. At some point, it reminds me of the play that Amiri Baraka did, which was a play, The Dutchman. You know, he has the same kind of, the gentleman who plays the lead in that has the same kind of energy, the same kind of battle. It's a story of a black man and a white woman on a subway train in New York, and the dynamics that go on about America, about race, and about color. And Jimmy is always talking about these topics. I was saying earlier, this notion of the citizenship contradiction. I call it nationality or citizenship. My good friends from the East Coast, they call it the citizenship contradiction. Meaning that when we're watching these events that James Baldwin and others are going through, when we're watching the contemporary events that we see that are impacting poor and African American communities, the question we're always asking is, where is the federal government? Where is the government? Where is the government during the sit-ins in the 1960s? Where is the government during the freedom rides? You know, why when students are sitting in the 1960s, when the police show up, they arrest the students, not the people who were beating the students. The citizenship contradiction. What does your citizenship, what does your nationality have to do with how much of a citizen that you are? Meaning, when you read through the Constitution, there's no statement in there that says second-class citizen. It doesn't say that. And as Jimmy and both Malcolm would allude to, that you're either a citizen or you're a slave. Either you have all the rights guaranteed under the Constitution or you don't. There's no halfway there. And when you saw Jimmy talking in that particular clip, he's saying this is why Malcolm X has an appeal. This is why Elijah Muhammad, which is a very, very interesting segment in the book, The Fire Next Time. James, quoting James, I love this piece. It comes as a great shock to discover the flag to which you have pledged allegiance has not pledged allegiance to you. It comes as a great shock to see Gary Cooper killing off the Indians, and although you're rooting for Gary Cooper, that the Indians are you. And this is that particular question that he's raising. There is a meeting in May of 1963 with Robert Kennedy, and it's covered in a couple of places, Lorraine Hansberry, and there's a gentleman there, Joe Smith. Joe Smith is a freedom rider. I mean, you had to be brave to be a freedom rider in this period of history. And I think that's one of the things that always drove James Baldwin to come back, because it was hard not to look at the bravery of these students. It reminds me a lot of the Black consciousness movement in South Africa, that despite the dangers, that people came back. I mean, despite the fact of going out in the street and the guns being opened up on you, the next day you went home and you came back again. That's what made the difference in South Africa, Soweto and Steve Biko and Black consciousness. And Kennedy is shocked at some point because Joe Smith dropped out of school to join the Freedom Rides. And Joe Smith is saying in there, he said this, to be in the same room with Robert Kennedy made him want to vomit. Okay? And, I mean, you know, it's pretty bold. Here's a young man, 21, 22 years old, who's sitting with the Attorney General, who's telling the Attorney General, hey, even be in the same room with you makes me want to throw up. And when Kennedy finds out that he wouldn't be willing to go and fight against Cuba, James Baldwin was actually part of what we call the Fair Play for Cuba. He said, Mr. Robert Kennedy didn't know that I would have trouble convincing my nephew to go to Cuba. For example, to liberate the Cubans in defense of a government which now says it's doing everything it can, which cannot liberate me. Now, there are 20 million people in this country, and you can't put them all in jail. I know how my nephew feels. I know how he feels. I know how the cats in the barbershop feel. A boy last week, he was 16 in San Francisco, told me on television, thank goodness we got him to talk, maybe someday thought to listen. He said, I've got no country. I've got no flag. Now, he's only 16 years old. I couldn't say to him, you do. I don't have any evidence to prove that. And Joe Smith goes on to say, he says, next time I pick up the gun, you can kiss the baby goodbye. And Lorraine Hansberry says the most important person you need to talk to. This is a key moment in history. This is before Kennedy is assassinated in November. This is before the interview that you saw. Lorraine Hansberry said the most important person to talk to in this room is this young man here. And Lorraine Hansberry gets up from the meeting and she walks out in some senses almost like she's sick. And this conversation is the next conversation that you see after. This is a turning point for James Baldwin. This is a turning point for the movement. And then the March on Washington, which, again, as I'm talking about book titles, a good friend of mine has written a book which is, again, a marvelous book. It's called The Speech. It's written by Gary Young. Gary Young it's a book just about the March on Washington. James Baldwin wasn't at the March on Washington. Although people contacted him and tried to ask him could he make the March on Washington not happen. And James Baldwin responds, he says, in my view, by that time, there was on one hand nothing to prevent. The march had already been co-opted. On the other hand, no way of stopping the people from descending from Washington. What struck me most horribly was that virtually no one in power, including blacks or Negroes who were somewhere next door to power, were able even remotely to accept the dimension, the depth of the passion and the faith of the people. And Malcolm X talks about this extensively. I like what James Baldwin says, because at some point when he's talking with Kennedy, he says that not only did Kennedy not understand what this moment was in history, and as I talked earlier about my experiences in the Black Panther Party, that moment in history, the years that I was a member of the Black Panther Party, 1967, 1968, up into the 1970s, it wasn't unusual, particularly as J. Edgar Hoover began to rain an attack on us, that friends and comrades, etc., either went into exile, were killed, or some of them still find themselves in jail. And as Malcolm X says, he says, no. He said it was a sellout, it was a takeover. When Jimmy Baldwin came in from Paris, they wouldn't even let him talk because they knew he wouldn't go by the script. So this is where James Baldwin was in 1963. That when the March on Washington occurred in 1963, that they weren't going to let James Baldwin speak. You see a picture of him there with Burt Lancaster, but they weren't going to let him. They weren't going to let him speak in any way, shape, or form. And James Baldwin explores this. He explores this through going to a meeting with Elijah Muhammad of the Nation of Islam. And it is true, when Mike Wallace did produce the film, The Hate That Hate Produced, most of America didn't know who the Nation of Islam were. They did not. Nation of Islam had started in the 1930s. In our communities, we loved the Nation of Islam for a couple of reasons, 2 or 3 reasons. Number one, because they treated women with respect. Number two, because they were involved in businesses. And number 3, because they called you sir. Meaning whenever they met you on the street, it was yes, sir. In fact, you find some African Americans that named their son sir, made their son's first name sir, so whenever you spoke to him, you had to refer to them by sir. And this is a very interesting exploration. It's a very powerful conversation that James Baldwin is having about this period of history in looking at the time here. And after 1969, you're going to see the same with James Baldwin. To give you a moment or two to ask questions, Amiri Baraka, in his eulogy of James Baldwin, he says, and I sum it up in this context, because he is powerful in our history. We don't necessarily look at him as a historian, but he fits well into those phases of black militancy and the civil rights movement. Amiri Baraka, who had his conflicts with James Baldwin, he says, when we saw and when we heard him, he made us feel good. He made us feel, for one thing, that we could defend ourselves and define ourselves, and that we were not in the world merely as animate slaves, but as terrifying measurers of what is good or evil, beautiful or ugly. Jimmy's voice, from Amiri Baraka, as much as Dr. King's or Malcolm X, helped shepherd and guide us forward through black liberation. And in that sense, James Baldwin is one of our historical griots. You really can't. He treats the English language like Jimi Hendrix treats a guitar. You know, when you hear Jimi Hendrix play a guitar, you would think that Jimmy was taking the guitar and bending it into a knot and tying it. And James Baldwin was the same way. He told Toni Morrison one time, he said, look, you have your crown. You bought it and you paid for it. Now you just need to wear it. Thank you. Is there a question? Hopefully not, because I don't know that much. Okay? Yes.
Rights movements?
Not that I know of. He talked about women in the movement, in the civil rights movement, but I don't know of anything specifically. He did do 2 conversations, I think, where it came up. One with Nikki Giovanni and another with Margaret Mead. Conversations on race with Margaret Mead, and another one with Nikki Giovanni. Have a wonderful day. Thank you for inviting me. Oh, okay. Excuse me.
Your thoughts are about Mr. Baldwin. Deep down inside of him, who do you think he really leaned more towards, Malcolm or Martin?
Towards Malcolm.
Well, it comes out in the speech, but I just meant in the heart because he had some of both.
Yeah, he had some of both, and I think he's wrestling with that all the time. And I think by the time he's at the March on Washington, and he sees his good friend, and then finally when he sees Fred Hampton murdered in his sleep in 1969, I think Baldwin has said, you know, he goes back to France after, in fact, even after Martin Luther King is killed. He leaves, and he goes back, and he buys the place that he's in, and he never wants to come back at that point. No, I don't think there's any doubt. When you read through his bodies of work, you know, writers and academics, don't listen to them, okay? Read his words. I don't listen to any academics, okay? Okay, you enjoy? Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
My
Thank
pleasure.
you so much.
Okay, was that what you wanted to hear? Okay. Okay. I'm going to keep the mic, Abby.